Welcome back. Joining in this part are Teng Jimeng, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Warwick Powell, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. Jimeng, I will start with you. You are a professional, you're the expert on Chinese movies. So how do you look at the movie? Mr. Kale said, according to him, it's a 10 out of 10.
Absolutely. This is quite a cinematic achievement made over the past decades. If you look at the Chinese history since 20,000, you can see that Chinese film industry has produced wonderful films about the Nanjing Massacre, for example, the film made by Zhang Yimou, The Flowers of War in 2011, The City of Life and Death, in 2010 by director Lu Chuan, called Nanjing, and many others, including Don't Cry Nanking, Massacres in Nanjing, and even Hong Kong directors made films that pertains to this very topic. But once again, I think Shen Nao's film is a tremendous contribution to the historical narrative and to the historical truth to be revealed to the general public in China and around the world. And so in the tradition of this kind of celebrating the historical consciousness under fire, this film stands tall in terms of telling the truth and also in educating the general public, and sounded this wake-up call for the world in terms of truth under siege.
Well, Jim, what makes the film stand out in a sense? It's very different from others, in a sense of the lack of graphic violence. It deals with that in a very sophisticated way, through sound design or obscure visuals. Screenwriter Zhang Ke said that they use this, quote, restrained approach to honor the victims without sensationalizing the violence. So this is actually, I watched this movie. I think it's well made. Everything is good. I just talked with my colleagues, before the show, who watched this movie. Everybody likes it. Everything is well done there. But this is the way it tells the story. And that's international for people from all walks of life, all around the corner. Yeah, they can enjoy, see the movie without it being, being imposed to those uncomfortable scenes.
Absolutely, I think the restraint you are describing, meaning showing less, suggesting more. I mean, much in the Chinese tradition of Liu Bai, leaving the margin for audiences to think and to ponder and to learn and to come up with their own impression and conclusions, can often make the kind of brutality more emotionally powerful, precisely because it forces the audience to imagine the audience imagination to do the heavy lifting. When a filmmaker or a journalist does spell out every detail, viewers are actually very much compelled to actively reconstruct the horror in their own minds, which can make the impact far more personal and haunting. And so in this way, the Zhang Ke's method shows the moral gravity and emotional intensity aren't mutually exclusive. To a large extent, this approach is a reminder that sometimes the most haunting stories are the ones told in whisper, not loud shouts.
Warwick, the film was released globally this week, on August 7th. The director Shen Nao calls it a living textbook for younger generation around the world. How important is it for people to watch the movie, which in a sense for me, I think it goes beyond the entertainment business. It's educational, it's about history based on true story against a large background, of course, the Nanjing Massacre there.
Yeah, look, I think it's incredibly important. And it's important in a few different ways, Chindor. Firstly, of course, for Chinese audiences, it's incredibly important because it touches on a pivotal part of China's own historical experience. And for many people, they have personal family connections to the massacre and the horrific events of that period. And it's important to honour those events and to honour those who suffered and died during that period. But it's also important, I think, because often narratives about war, and particularly the Second World War, have been dominated by the voices of the West. And those voices have framed wars and the results of the Second World War largely through their own experiences. That, of course, is understandable, but it is only one lens. And unfortunately, that lens tends to exclude or even silence the experiences of many others. So I think it's important in that regard too, because it rounds out the global understanding of an event that had global significance. And of course, looking forward, it's significant too because it enables us as people across the entire globe to think through those elements of shared experiences and hopefully through that find common ground, particularly in the current moment where there is so much tension and division across the globe. So for China and for the world, films like this are particularly important.
Mm-hmm. What you mentioned about basically, when people mention the Second World War, it's often scenes about coming out of the European theater, Nazi Germany, but not much about what's happened in Asia, in particular in the Asia theater, in the Chinese theater, what China went through, and also how important probably a role China played during that time. China basically, forces engaged about 80% of the Japanese forces at that time, and the number of Chinese military or civilians casualties exceeded 35 million. And that's a huge number. So 80 years later, again, it is also important to look at the truth, what really happened, or what kind of contribution or role China played at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also important to understand that China's experience of the Second World War actually predates what is generally understood as the time period of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. China's experience of the Second World War, of course, began when the Japanese first came and invaded, and that took place some years earlier. And for the entire period of the 1930s, and then, of course, all the way through to 1949, there was warfare on the mainland of China. And as you mentioned, the number of casualties and the number of dead in fighting those wars, in tackling fascism and Japanese imperialism, took its toll. It destroyed the country. It destroyed a generation of people. And it is important, I think, from a global perspective to not only appreciate the sacrifices that the Chinese people went through in the defense of their own nation, but the role that played ultimately in holding back the Japanese, in causing the Japanese to have its own resources depleted, and creating time, in a sense, for the rest of the Allied forces to mobilise and get its act together. The other thing to remember, Chindor, is that during the 1930s, when this particular massacre took place, the United States was actually not involved directly in the war, but was Japan's principal supplier of commodities, steel, iron, and other critical materials that the Japanese army needed for its own military campaigns. And it wasn't until the early 1940s that the Americans stopped doing that. So the Americans, in fact, played a role throughout this period, well before they became officially engaged in the war itself.
That's right. Jimeng, speak of nowadays, of course, China and other Asian countries' relationship with Japan, largely peaceful, stable, but still, when it comes to this part of history, people have a hard time. to, especially when there's, it always faces unfortunate truth, the lack of full apology, acknowledgement to the atrocities committed during the Japanese militarism at the time. And of course, the controversies every time the Japanese school textbook, downplaying event like Nanjing Massacre, the use of comfort women, forced labor, etc. And activists, scholars, government officials have urged, I would say, continue to urge Japan to emulate Germany, basically full acknowledgement of what happened. And also, the Germany built museums, memorials to remember the victims and, taught its dark past to its youth in history textbooks. Its leaders apologized to their victims frequently, sincerely, and in the full way. Why can't Japan do that? Just like what Germany did.
Well, Japan's reluctance to fully acknowledge and confront its wartime atrocities has been a long-standing source of tension in East Asia, particularly with China and South Korea, and other countries that suffered under Japanese occupation. This hesitancy, to me, is visible in multiple ways, especially official statements that use ambiguous or euphemistic language. The omission or dilution of historical facts in school textbooks, and political gestures that appear to honor wartime leaders or military units implicated in atrocities, such as visits to Yasukuni's shrine by certain Japanese politicians. But for countries like China and South Korea, which endured immense during World War II, such actions feel like a denial of lived history. And so in this case, I think the Nanjing Massacre involved the coercions of comfort women and exploitations of forced labor. All these issues remain part of the collective history, while Japan denied the kind of history and the memory will cause tremendous mistrust and the loss of this very good faith in dealing countries like China and South Korea in terms of diplomatic relations. Globally, Japan's stance can be still described as a mix of selective acknowledgement and strategic ambiguity. And so Japan, if it continues to position itself as a peace-loving country with its pacifist constitution, should come to terms with the past, the way that the Germans would do over the past, 80 years. I mean, the idea of coming to terms with its past is key for Japan to understand, to acknowledge, and to apologize sincerely to countries like China, South Korea, and many Southeast Asian countries who suffer tremendously during World War II. And so Germany, of course, especially West Germany, provided a typical example in this case. And I think Japan and Japanese politicians
we have to
follow
stop
this.
there, Jimeng. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.